And I was a little bit hesitant to include this slide in my presentation because it really goes back to the beginning. It is the kind of the key issue that they all try to tackle. It is, how do you relate agency and structure? I think if there is a common theme within practice theories, it is this agency structure reformulation. And even John also mentioned that this concept of practice, it is the kind of the mediating concept between agency and structure. With Giddens, and I think he has the most forceful formulation of this topic, in particular in Constitution of Society of '84, then you see the argument with at the time was a real kind of innovative argument in sociology, because he said only social practices and actors, they have real existence. Structures only have virtual existence. That means that structures only exist when they are being used by actors, when they make their practices, when they draw upon the rules and resources to make their practices work. That's the moment that basically you see rules and resources structures becoming real things, visible things, patterns, time, space, structured things. So don't go for agency to lock it up in the micro level with individual actors and reserve then structure for macro theory. Just get rid of this micro-macro distinction. And then I think if you read Giddens well, he said replace it, if you want to make a kind of division of labor in social sciences, replace it with doing an institutional analysis from a system perspective and combine it, secondly, with an analysis of agency, and he calls it analysis of strategic conduct. And you should do it for one and the same social practice. So don't make the division of labor. The macro people go for markets and globalization, and the micro people go for the supermarket and the home. No, that's not a kind of fruitful division of labor. You should really keep these things together. So that was the most theoretical thing I'm going to say today. From now on, I'm trying to work with practice theory and translate it to doing empirical research for sustainable consumption. And then, of course, you need something of a definition of the key concept of practice itself. And I think the most popular one at the moment is also the one I think Alan Ward will have discussed with you. It is basically put forward by Andreas Reckwitz, but he was discussing the work of Schatzky in that article. So basically, I think it's Schatzky who is the key author behind this definition. And it's called a routinized type of behavior consisting of several elements interconnected to one another. And then there is the enumeration of the key elements of practice. It's forms of bodily activities, forms of mental activities, things and their use. I think that's a very nice way of saying it. A background knowledge in the form of understanding, know-how, states of emotion, and motivational knowledge. So this is including everything. You can see there is this material element to it. There is this kind of mental attitude element in it. There is not just things, objects, but things and their use. So there is practice dimension. At the level of practice, you have particular dynamics. People know what to do when they are participating in a particular practice because they are in that practice. And that's kind of what we call an emergent property of practices. I think this is very important. So I would suggest let's stick to that as a formal definition. I think everything is in it. The only other discussion on practices, how to define them, is, and that's the one also borrowed from Schatzky, it's the one between dispersed practices and integrated practices. I don't think it's very well elaborated yet. It is something still kind of developing as a discussion. So Schatzky said some practices, they are kind of standardized practices used over a range of settings, like shaking hands, and other practices he calls integrated practices like cooking. Well, it's important just to mention it, that it is not yet settled at what level and what kind of, how do you say, scope should that practice concept have. So I have to make my own decisions here. And when I started working with practice theory for the study of consumption, I just more or less draw up this picture, and I stick to it all the time because it's very recognizable in publications and so on. But of course you can debate all kind of elements in it. But the crucial thing is that I put practices central stage. So you have a series of practices, and they should be the key focus of analysis. So not the individuals, not the systems themselves or alone, just practices. And if you want to look at the systemic dimension, the systems of provision behind the practices, as Ben Fine would call it, then you start with the practices, and from that you define your system, the relevant parts of the systems. I would say the other relevant parts of the networks that influence what is happening here. So go from the practice to the system and do the same as the individual. If you talk lifestyles, don't talk lifestyles of the general population, like the Bourdieu people do, like most of the consultancy agents working with Bourdieu do. They make the Brazilian population, and then you said you have progressive, eco-progressive people, and you have eco-conservative people, and people in between, and another 5 classes. But they use the general population, and I think it's not very helpful. So if you want to make segmentations of lifestyle groups, start with practices again. So start with food, shopping for food, and if you are in the supermarket, then define the relevant socio-economic or lifestyle segmentations. So I think that's the innovation of this approach, that you use the practices to define the relevance parts of the system and the lifestyles to be defined. Are you still with me? Okay, thank you. So what kind of practices do you select? Because you are more or less free as an empirical researcher to take whatever practice you want. Everything fits that definition of Schatzky. So what I decided to do is, when you talk about sustainable consumption, that consumption practices have to be defined as integrated practices. And here I'm a little bit different from Alan Ward, because he has a very detailed and a very interesting and fascinating discussion on that not everything is consumption in social life. Not all practices are consumption practices. And I disagree with him here. So maybe some food for thought and further discussion. But I just say, well, you have consumption practices, and they are happening in everyday life. So that means that all people are familiar with these practices. For example, shopping in a supermarket is something everybody knows. Whether you are in Asia or in Latin America or in the Netherlands, people know about the rules and the resources needed, the ways they should behave, the ways of saying and doing in a supermarket. So it's an everyday life public event. It's accessible in principle to all of us. That was my second criteria. And the third criteria, there should be, of course, an environmental gain in looking at these kind of consumption practices. So all consumption practices, they have impacts. They have a footprint. But from a policy making point of view, you of course want to address the practices that matter, the consumption practices that have the highest environmental imprint, the highest footprint.